There's nothing quite like the sting of being the town joke, especially when you're just trying to live quietly on the land your family worked for generations. Dolores Ramsey knew that feeling well. Every trip to town brought whispers and chuckles about her pig that dug in the same spot behind her barn, day after day, year after year. The neighbors thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. Even her own sister would shake her head and say the pig had lost its mind. But on a cold Tuesday morning, when that pig started digging more frantically than usual, something told Dolores to pay attention. She grabbed her husband's old shovel and decided to see what all the fuss was about. 3 feet down, she hit metal. What she pulled up from that hard-packed earth would change everything. Not just for her, but for everyone who had ever laughed. What happens when the joke turns out to be hiding the biggest secret Cedar Valley has ever known? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The metal box fragment lay on Dolores Ramsey's kitchen table like an unwelcome visitor, its rusted edges catching the morning light that streamed through her grandmother's lace curtains. She turned it over in her weathered hands, feeling the weight of something that had been deliberately hidden beneath 3 feet of Colorado soil for who knew how long. The fragment was roughly the size of her palm, corroded but solid, with what looked like part of a hinge still attached to one edge. Dolores had lived on this land for 47 years, first as a young bride when Frank brought her here, then as a widow for the past 3. She knew every fence post, every seasonal wildflower patch, every stone that jutted from the pasture. Yet this piece of metal felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else's story entirely. The ranch stretched across 80 acres of rolling hills and meadow grass, bordered by national forest land that had protected it from the development creeping through Cedar Valley. Frank's great-grandfather had homesteaded here in 1889, building the original cabin that still formed the heart of their current home. 3 generations of Ramseys had worked this land, raised cattle and children, weathered droughts and harsh winters with the kind of stubborn determination that ran in mountain families. Frank had been gone for 3 years now, a heart attack while mending fence on a hot August afternoon. Dolores found him there that evening, his hat still shading his face, his tools laid out neat and orderly the way he always left them. The grief had nearly broken her that first year, but the land had held her together. Every morning brought chores that needed doing, animals that depended on her, responsibilities that didn't pause for sorrow. Her sister Lucy had been after her to sell ever since the funeral. "You're 53 years old, Dolores. You shouldn't be out there alone, trying to run a ranch by yourself. Frank wouldn't want you struggling like this." Lucy lived in Denver with her husband and teenage son Tom, in a tidy suburban house with neighbors close enough to borrow sugar from. She couldn't understand why anyone would choose the isolation of mountain living, the endless cycle of feeding animals and mending things that broke. But Dolores understood something her sister didn't. This land held more than just grass and trees. It held the echoes of every conversation she and Frank had shared on the front porch, every sunrise they'd watched together over coffee, every plan they'd made for their future. Selling would be like erasing their life together, reducing 44 years of marriage to a real estate transaction. The ranch supported a modest herd of 15 cattle, a handful of chickens, and 1 pig named Wilbur, who had arrived 2 years ago as payment for helping neighbor Pete Morrison with his hay. Pete's granddaughter had raised Wilbur for a 4-H project, but when it came time for the county fair, she couldn't bear to send him to slaughter. Dolores had agreed to take him, thinking he'd be good company and might help with pest control around the garden. What she hadn't expected was Wilbur's peculiar obsession with one particular spot behind the barn. Every morning, without fail, the pig would trot to the same 20-foot patch of seemingly unremarkable ground and begin digging. Not casual rooting like pigs normally do, but focused, determined excavation that left craters deep enough to twist an ankle. Dolores had filled in those holes dozens of times, but Wilbur always returned to dig them out again. The neighbors found it endlessly amusing. At Murphy's General Store, where everyone gathered for coffee and gossip, Wilbur's digging had become a running joke. "How's that crazy pig of yours, Dolores? Still trying to dig his way to China?" Old Pete Morrison would slap his knee and chuckle. "Maybe he smells something down there. Probably just wants to cool off in the summer." Even Lucy couldn't resist commenting during her monthly phone calls. "I swear, Dolores, that pig is as stubborn as you are. Normal animals don't act like that. Maybe there's something wrong with him." She'd suggest everything from veterinary checkups to pig psychology. As if such a thing existed, Dolores had consulted Dr. Patricia Hayes, the local veterinarian who'd been caring for ranch animals in Cedar Valley for 20 years. Dr. Hayes examined Wilbur thoroughly and pronounced him perfectly healthy. "Some pigs are just particular about their habits," she'd said with a shrug. "As long as he's eating well and seems happy, I wouldn't worry about it. Pigs are intelligent animals. Maybe he's found something interesting that we can't detect." The suggestion that Wilbur might actually be onto something had seemed ridiculous at the time. But this morning, watching him dig with unusual urgency, Dolores had felt compelled to investigate. Frank's old shovel still hung in the tool shed where he'd left it, the wooden handle worn smooth by decades of use. She'd taken it to Wilbur's favorite spot and begun digging alongside him, more out of curiosity than any real expectation of finding something significant. The first 2 feet revealed nothing but packed earth and the occasional rock. But at 3 feet, her shovel had struck something solid and metallic. The sound rang clear and sharp in the morning air, not the dull thunk of hitting stone, but the distinctive clink of metal on metal. Wilbur had snorted with what seemed like satisfaction and stepped back as if his job was done. Now, sitting in her kitchen with Frank's wedding ring, a simple gold band she kept in a small wooden box on the windowsill, nearby for comfort. Dolores studied the fragment more carefully. It was clearly part of something larger, manufactured rather than natural. The metal looked old, but not ancient, with the kind of corrosion that suggested decades rather than centuries underground. Through the window, she could see Wilbur standing at his usual spot, not digging now, but watching the house with an alert expression that was almost human in its intensity. He seemed to be waiting for her to do something, as if discovering this piece was only the first step in a process he'd been trying to initiate for 3 years. The rational part of her mind suggested practical explanations. Perhaps a previous owner had buried farm equipment or old tools. The fragment could be part of a broken plow or harrow, discarded and forgotten over the years. But something about its deliberate placement 3 feet down, and Wilbur's persistent focus on that exact location, suggested this wasn't random debris. Cedar Valley had been settled in the 1880s, part of the mining boom that brought prospectors and homesteaders to the Colorado Rockies. The valley had never produced significant mineral wealth, but it had served as a way station for travelers heading to more prosperous camps higher in the mountains. Old-timers still told stories about the early days, when the area attracted a rough mix of legitimate settlers and less savory characters looking for places to disappear. Dolores's own family history was typical of the region, hard-working, people who'd claimed land and made it productive through sheer determination. Frank's family had similar roots, though his great-grandfather had arrived a few years later than hers. Neither family had ever been involved in anything more exciting than cattle ranching and hay farming, as far as she knew, but families didn't always share their complete histories. Dolores had learned that lesson when going through Frank's papers after his death. Hidden in his desk drawer, she'd found old photographs she'd never seen before, showing the ranch in its early days, with buildings and structures that no longer existed. Frank had never mentioned these photos, never talked about the ranch's history. Beyond the basic facts every local family knew, the afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the kitchen windows when Dolores finally stood and walked to the phone. If anyone in Cedar Valley knew about the area's hidden history, it would be Vernon Dale, the retired teacher who'd been documenting local stories for the Historical Society. Vernon lived alone in a cottage near the old schoolhouse, surrounded by boxes of photographs, documents, and recordings he'd collected over 30 years of local research. She dialed his number and waited through 4 rings before his familiar voice answered. "Vernon Dale speaking." "Vernon, it's Dolores Ramsey. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "Dolores, not at all. I was just organizing some old mining claims records. What can I do for you?" She looked down at the metal fragment in her hand. "I found something on my property that I'd like you to take a look at, if you have time. Something that was buried behind my barn." There was a brief pause before Vernon responded, and when he did, his tone had shifted slightly. "Buried, you say? How deep?" "About 3 feet. It's a piece of metal. Looks old. My pig has been digging in that spot for 3 years, and this morning I decided to see what he was after." "That's quite interesting. Would you mind if I came by this evening to have a look? I'm familiar with most of the area's history, and I might be able to help identify what you've found. I'd appreciate that. Would 7 o'clock work?" "Perfect. I'll see you then." After hanging up, Dolores returned to the fragment on the table. Whatever it was, it had been important enough for someone to bury deliberately, and persistent enough to capture a pig's attention for 3 years. She had the feeling that by tomorrow morning, her quiet life on the ranch might be considerably less quiet. Outside, Wilbur continued his patient vigil, and Dolores wondered what other secrets lay buried beneath the land she'd called home for most of her adult life. Vernon Dale arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, driving slowly up the gravel road as if he were already thinking about what Dolores might have found. She watched from the front porch, noting how he sat in his truck for a moment before getting out, studying the landscape with the careful attention of someone who understood more than he'd let on during their phone conversation. "Evening, Dolores. Thank you for calling me about this." Vernon carried a worn leather satchel and moved with the purposeful stride of a man on a mission. "I brought some materials that might help us figure out what you've discovered." In the kitchen, Dolores placed the metal fragment on the table between them. Vernon examined it under the bright overhead light, turning it over in hands that trembled slightly, not from age, she realized, but from excitement or perhaps concern. "This is definitely part of a strongbox," he said after several minutes of careful study. "I'd estimate it's from the 1920s, maybe early 1930s. The construction and hardware are consistent with containers used for storing valuables during that period." "What kind of valuables?" Vernon set the fragment down and opened his satchel. "That depends on who buried it and why. But given the location and the time period, I have some theories." He pulled out a manila folder thick with documents and photographs. "Dolores, your property has a history that most people in Cedar Valley have forgotten. During Prohibition, this area was part of a major smuggling route." The photographs he spread across the table made Dolores's breath catch. Black and white images showed groups of well-dressed men standing near wooden crates and barrels, with her own barn clearly visible in the background of several shots. The barn looked different, smaller and older, but it was unmistakably the same building. "These were taken around 1928, Vernon explained. Federal agents were investigating reports of illegal alcohol moving through the valley. Your property, with its remote location and good road access, would have been perfect for their purposes." Dolores studied the faces in the photographs, looking for any resemblance to family members she might recognize. "Are you saying criminals were using our land without permission?" "Not without permission, no." Vernon pulled out a typewritten document that looked official. "I found this in the state archives last month. It's a federal report from 1932 listing properties suspected of cooperation with smuggling operations. Your ranch is mentioned specifically. The document was formal and bureaucratic, but its implications were clear. References to ongoing collaboration, financial compensation, and storage facilities painted a picture that made Dolores uncomfortable. Her family's name appeared multiple times, always in connection with payments and logistical support. "This has to be wrong," she said. "My family were honest people. We've been ranching here for generations. We wouldn't have gotten involved with bootleggers." Vernon's expression was understanding, but firm. "Dolores, you have to remember what times were like back then. The country was heading into the Depression, and many ranch families were struggling to keep their land. When smuggling organizations offered substantial money for cooperation, a lot of otherwise honest people saw it as their only option. He showed her another document, a handwritten ledger with dates, amounts, and abbreviated location codes. One entry read, "Mountain property, our family, 500 month, 1930-1933, in Depression-era dollars." That represented serious money. $500 a month would have been enough to save a failing ranch, Vernon continued. For families facing foreclosure, cooperation with bootleggers might have seemed like the lesser of two evils. The idea that her grandparents might have made such a choice was difficult to accept. But Dolores found herself remembering stories about those hard years. Family legends about how they'd managed to keep the ranch when so many neighbors lost theirs. Vague references to outside help that had never been explained in detail. Even if that's true, she said, it was 90 years ago. What does it have to do with what I found today? Vernon leaned forward, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. Because operations like this generated enormous profits that had to be hidden somewhere. When the law started closing in, or when things got too dangerous, they needed secure places to store their assets. Remote properties with cooperative owners were ideal for that purpose. He opened his folder again and pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Federal Raid Ends Mountain Smuggling Ring, Several Dead in Gun Battle." The article was dated March 15, 1933, and described a violent confrontation that had effectively ended Prohibition-era smuggling in the region. "This raid happened about 20 miles from here," Vernon explained. 3 smugglers were killed, and several others disappeared rather than risk arrest. The leader of the operation, a man named Thomas Kellerman, was never found. Neither were the assets his organization had accumulated over nearly a decade of successful smuggling. Dolores read the article carefully, noting references to substantial sums of money and valuable goods that federal agents believed had been hidden throughout the region. The investigation had continued for months, but most of the hidden assets were never recovered. "You think Kellerman's money is buried on my property? I think it's possible. The timing fits. Your family was receiving payments right up until the raid happened. If Kellerman needed to hide assets quickly, your ranch would have been a logical choice." Vernon pulled out one more document, a map of Cedar Valley from the 1930s, marked with X's and notations in different handwriting. Several X's were clustered around the area where Dolores's property was located. "This was found among federal investigation files," he said. "It appears to be a search map created by agents looking for hidden assets. They suspected this area but never found anything definitive." The kitchen fell quiet, except for the steady ticking of Frank's old mantel clock. Dolores stared at the map, trying to process the idea that her quiet ranch might be sitting on top of a criminal fortune. The metal fragment on the table suddenly seemed much more significant. "If you're right," she said slowly, "then there could be a lot more than just one buried box out there." "Substantially more, yes. We're potentially talking about the accumulated profits from years of successful smuggling operations. In today's money, that could be worth millions." The magnitude of the possibility was overwhelming. Dolores thought about her financial struggles, the mounting bills, Lucy's constant pressure to sell the ranch. The idea that salvation might be buried literally in her own backyard seemed too good to be true. "But if this money exists," she continued, "other people might know about it. People who would want to claim it for themselves." Vernon nodded gravely. "That's exactly what concerns me. Stories about hidden prohibition money have been circulating in certain circles for decades. If word gets out about your discovery, you could attract unwanted attention from people who wouldn't hesitate to take what they want by force." "What are you suggesting?" "That we need to be very careful about how we proceed. If there really is a significant find on your property, it has to be handled legally and safely. We can't just start digging up your ranch without proper preparation and protection." As Vernon prepared to leave, He gathered his documents, but left the metal fragment on the table. "Don't do any more digging until we can plan this properly," he warned. "And don't mention this to anyone else for now. Tomorrow, I'll make some calls to people who can help us figure out the right way to handle whatever is buried out there." After his truck disappeared into the darkness, Dolores sat alone with the fragment and 1,000 racing thoughts. Through the window, she could see Wilbur silhouetted against the star-filled sky, still maintaining his watch over the digging, spot as if he understood the importance of what they discovered. The buried strongbox represented more than just hidden money. It was a disruption of everything she thought she knew about her family and her future. Whether that disruption would prove to be a blessing or a dangerous complication remained to be seen. But there was no returning to the simple life she'd awakened to that morning, whatever secrets lay beneath her land. Wilbur had been trying to tell her about them for 3 years. Now she was finally ready to listen. The 1920s photograph lay spread across Dolores's kitchen table like evidence from another lifetime. 5 men in dark suits and bowler hats stood casually beside her barn, though the building looked smaller and cruder than its current form. Behind them, wooden crates were stacked in organized rows, and she could make out the distinctive shapes of glass bottles nestled in straw packing. What struck her most was how relaxed these men appeared, as if they belonged there. Vernon had returned early that morning with a canvas bag full of documents and an old Garrett metal detector borrowed from a friend in town. His eyes were red-rimmed from a night spent researching in the basement archives of the Cedar Valley Historical Society. This photograph came from federal files declassified in the 1970s, he explained, pointing to the image with a pencil. The tall man on the left is Thomas Kellerman. He ran the most sophisticated smuggling operation in this part of Colorado from 1925 to 1933. Dolores examined Kellerman's face more closely. He was lean and well-dressed, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was accustomed to getting his way. Even in the grainy photograph, his eyes seemed alert and calculating. He looks like he was in charge of everything. He was. Kellerman's organization moved thousands of gallons of illegal alcohol from Canada to Denver and beyond. They were successful because they were organized and because they cultivated relationships with local property owners who could provide storage and logistical support. Vernon pulled out another document, this one bearing the official seal of the Treasury Department. Federal agents knew this area was important to the operation, but they could never gather enough evidence for successful prosecutions. The Treasury report made uncomfortable reading. It referenced ongoing cooperation from local ranching families, regular financial compensation, and sophisticated storage facilities. Dolores's family name appeared in several contexts, always connected to payments and property usage. "This still doesn't prove my grandparents were criminals," she said, though her conviction was wavering. Maybe they were threatened. Maybe they didn't have a choice. Vernon's response was gentle but realistic. The financial records suggest willing participation rather than coercion. The payments to your family were substantial, $500. Monthly from 1930 to 1933. That was serious money during the Depression years. He spread out additional photographs showing different aspects of the operation. In one particularly clear image, she could see the massive oak tree that still dominated her eastern pasture. Men in work clothes were unloading heavy containers from a truck parked beneath its branches. "This oak tree appears in multiple photographs," Vernon noted, tapping the image with his pencil. "It seems to have been a consistent landmark for their operations. I suspect we'll find additional burial sites in that vicinity." They walked out to examine the tree, Wilbur trotting ahead of them with unusual animation. The pig seemed to understand that something significant was happening, and he led them directly to several spots where the metal detector registered strong signals. "Multiple hits," Vernon announced, marking each location with a small orange flag. "Deep enough to be deliberate burials, shallow enough to be recoverable." Someone put a lot of thought into this. The morning's work revealed the scope of what they were dealing with. Using careful excavation techniques Vernon had learned during his teaching years, they uncovered the corner of what appeared to be a large wooden crate buried about 2 feet beneath the oak tree's root system. The metal detector indicated several more objects in the immediate area. "This is definitely part of an organized cache," Vernon said, brushing soil away from the wooden corner. "The depth is consistent, the spacing is methodical. Someone buried multiple containers here with the intention of retrieving them later, but they never came back. The 1933 raid probably prevented that." According to the newspaper reports, Kellerman and several of his key associates were either killed or disappeared immediately after the federal action. Anyone who might have known the exact location of these burial sites was either dead or in hiding. As they worked, Dolores became aware of increased traffic on the usually quiet road that passed her property. Cars drove slowly, some making obvious U-turns to pass a second time. She mentioned this to Vernon, who straightened up and scanned the road with concern. "Word travels fast in small communities," he said. "If people have noticed unusual activity here, speculation will start spreading. We need to be careful about how we proceed." "What kind of careful?" Vernon gestured toward the partially excavated crate. "We're potentially dealing with substantial assets that have been hidden for 90 years. That kind of discovery attracts attention from people who aren't interested in historical preservation or legal ownership rights." The implications were sobering. Dolores looked around her peaceful ranch with new awareness of its vulnerability. The nearest neighbor lived 2 miles away, and the sheriff's office was in town, a 20-minute drive under the best conditions. "Are you saying we're in danger?" "I'm saying we need to approach this intelligently. This discovery is too significant to handle casually, and it's too valuable to ignore. We need expert help and proper legal guidance before we go any further." Vernon began carefully reburying the exposed corner of the crate, explaining that leaving evidence visible would only invite problems. "There's an archaeologist in Denver I've worked with on other historical projects. Dr. James Crawford specializes in 20th century sites, and he has connections with federal authorities who handle discoveries like this." Federal authorities. Treasure trove law is complicated, especially when the original assets may have been obtained illegally. "We need to understand our rights and responsibilities before we excavate anything else." They spent the rest of the morning methodically mapping the metal. Detector hits around both the oak tree and Wilbur's original digging spot. The pattern that emerged suggested a well-planned storage system with multiple cache points distributed across several acres of Dolores's property. Kellerman was obviously thinking long-term, Vernon observed as they reviewed their rough map. "This isn't random hiding, it's systematic asset management by someone who expected to be in business for years." As Vernon prepared to leave that afternoon, he made Dolores promise not to do any additional digging until they could bring in proper help. "I'll contact Dr. Crawford today and explain what we found. If he's willing to get involved, we can proceed safely and legally. And if he's not—" Vernon's expression was serious. "Then we'll need to find another way to handle this, because ignoring it isn't an option. Too many people are already asking questions about what you found." After he drove away, Dolores stood beside the reburied oak tree site and tried to process the magnitude of what lay beneath her feet. The metal fragment that had started everything now seemed like the smallest part of a much larger puzzle, one that connected her quiet ranch to stories of crime, violence, and hidden wealth. Wilbur settled beside her, no longer digging, but maintaining his alert watch over the area, as if he understood that his years of patient excavation had finally accomplished their purpose. Whatever happened next, the pig had fulfilled his role as guardian of secrets that were no longer secret. The question now was whether those revelations would prove to be a blessing or the beginning of troubles she wasn't prepared to handle. The Prohibition-era map spread across Vernon's kitchen table like a treasure hunter's dream, its hand-drawn lines and careful notations revealing the scope of Thomas Kellerman's operation. Vernon had called Dolores that morning with news that Dr. Crawford was driving up from Denver. But first, he wanted to show her what his overnight research had uncovered. This was hidden inside a book of poetry in Kellerman's personal effects, Vernon explained, his voice barely containing his excitement. Federal agents found it during a 1934 search of his Denver apartment, 2 years after he disappeared. It shows the entire smuggling network throughout this valley. Dolores studied the map carefully, recognizing landmarks and property boundaries that still existed today. Her ranch was marked with multiple X's and detailed notations about underground storage areas and tunnel systems. Most disturbing of all was a series of lines connecting various buildings on her property, suggesting an elaborate network she'd never known existed. According to this, Vernon continued, pointing to specific markings, there's a tunnel system that runs from your barn to the old oak tree, with branch passages leading to at least 3 other cache points. Kellerman wasn't just burying individual containers, he was creating a sophisticated underground storage facility. The implications were staggering. Dolores looked at the map's legend, which included symbols for primary storage, emergency cache and escape route. Her property wasn't just a hiding place, it had been designed as the central hub of the entire operation. How is this possible? We've lived here for generations. Someone would have noticed tunnels. Not necessarily. These would have been built to be invisible, probably accessed through existing structures like root cellars or barn foundations. The entrances could be hidden behind false walls or under movable floor sections. Vernon pulled out another document, a typed inventory list with Thomas Kellerman's signature at the bottom. The contents made Dolores's heart race. 47 cases silver certificates, 12 containers gold coins, 23 boxes jewelry and precious stones, 156 bottles premium whiskey, miscellaneous bonds and currency. Total estimated value, $890,000. $890,000 in 1933 money, Vernon said quietly. That's worth well over $10 million today. The sound of a car in Vernon's driveway interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Dolores could see a black sedan with Colorado plates and 2 men in business suits getting out. Something about their purposeful movement and expensive clothes made her nervous. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked. Vernon frowned and moved to the window for a better look. "No, and I don't recognize them." His expression grew concerned as the 2 men approached the front door. "These aren't the kind of visitors I usually get." The doorbell rang, followed immediately by firm knocking. Vernon opened the door cautiously, leaving the chain latch engaged. "Mr. Dale, my name is Marcus Reed. I represent certain business interests in Denver. I'd like to discuss some historical research you've been conducting." Reed was a well-dressed man in his 50s, with the kind of smooth confidence that suggested he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. His companion was younger and more physically imposing, though he remained silent. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," Vernon replied carefully. "My historical work is all a matter of public record." "Of course it is. But some of your recent discoveries might have implications beyond academic interest. Perhaps we could come in and discuss this privately." Vernon glanced back at Dolores, who shook her head slightly. Something about Reed's manner set off warning signals. Too polite, too persistent, too well-informed about activities that should have been private. "I'm afraid this isn't a good time," Vernon said. "If you'd like to schedule an appointment through proper channels." "Mr. Dale," Reed interrupted, his tone becoming more direct. "We understand that artifacts have been discovered on the Ramsey property. Artifacts that might be of considerable value to collectors and historians. We're prepared to offer substantial compensation for information about these discoveries. The fact that Reed knew about Dolores's find, and that he'd tracked down Vernon's involvement so quickly, was deeply troubling. They'd been careful to keep their research quiet, yet somehow word had leaked to people with resources and connections far beyond the local community. "I don't know what you're talking about," Vernon said firmly, "and I think you should leave." Reed's expression hardened slightly, though his voice remained professionally courteous. "Of course. But please keep in mind that historical artifacts found on private property can sometimes involve complex legal questions. Questions that might be resolved more favorably with proper guidance and support. After the men left, Vernon double-checked his door locks and closed the curtains. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," he said. "Somehow, news of your discovery has reached people who aren't interested in historical preservation. How could they know already? We've barely told anyone. In today's digital age, information travels fast. Property records, historical documents, even old federal files are accessible to people with the right connections and resources." Vernon began gathering the maps and documents from his table. "We need to accelerate our timeline. Dr. Crawford needs to see this today." They drove to Dolores's ranch in Vernon's truck, taking a circuitous route to make sure they weren't being followed. The familiar landscape looked different now, not peaceful and isolated, but vulnerable and exposed. Every passing car seemed suspicious. Every normal ranch activity felt like it was being watched. At the ranch, they found Wilbur exhibiting unusual behavior. Instead of his normal calm presence at the digging site, the pig was agitated, pacing in circles and snorting nervously. When Dolores approached him, he led her directly to fresh tire tracks near the barn, tracks that definitely weren't from Vernon's truck or her own vehicle. "Someone's been here," she said, examining the deep impressions left by wide tires. "Recently, while we were at your place." Vernon studied the tracks with growing alarm. "These are from a heavy vehicle, probably a truck or large SUV. And look here, boot prints leading toward your barn." They followed the prints, which led directly to the barn's main entrance. The door was still locked, but scratches around the lock suggested someone had attempted to force entry. More disturbing were the small holes drilled in the barn's wooden siding, holes that looked like they could accommodate surveillance equipment. "They're watching the property," Vernon said. "We're probably trying to figure out exactly what you found and where it might be located." Inside the house, Dolores called the sheriff's office to report the trespassing. Deputy Sheriff Janet Morrison promised to increase patrols in the area, but she also warned that without evidence of actual theft or damage, there wasn't much law enforcement could do about suspicious activity. "You might want to consider staying somewhere else for a few days," Deputy Morrison suggested, "until we can determine what these people want and whether they represent a genuine threat." After hanging up, Dolores looked around the kitchen that had been her sanctuary for decades. The idea of abandoning her home because of threats from strangers seemed unthinkable, but the alternative, facing whatever Marcus Reed and his associates might do, was equally frightening. Vernon was studying Kellerman's map again, this time focusing on the detailed notations about tunnel entrances and access points. "There's something here we're missing," he said. "Reed showed up too quickly and knew too much. Either someone in the community is feeding him information, or there's another source." As if summoned by his words, the phone rang. Dolores answered to hear Lucy's voice, excited and breathless. "Dolores, you won't believe what happened today. A man from Denver called me about our family's property. He said you might have found something valuable, and he wanted to discuss a business opportunity." Isn't that exciting? The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. Reed hadn't needed inside information or sophisticated surveillance. He'd simply contacted family members and used their natural curiosity and financial concerns to gather the intelligence he needed. "Lucy, what exactly did you tell him?" "Well, I mentioned that you'd been acting strangely lately, and that Vernon Dale had been spending time at the ranch. I thought maybe you'd found some old family heirlooms or something." "Why, did I do something wrong?" Dolores closed her eyes, understanding that their window of privacy and safety had just closed completely. Whatever happened next would happen under the watchful eyes of people whose intentions were far from benevolent. The bootlegger's ledger lay open on Dolores's kitchen table, like a confession from the past. Its pages filled with meticulous entries that revealed the true scope of Thomas Kellerman's criminal empire. Vernon had found it that morning in a waterproof metal container buried beneath the barn's foundation stones, exactly where the Prohibition-era map had indicated it would be. "These records are incredible," Vernon said, running his finger down columns of figures that represented fortunes in Depression-era money. Kellerman documented everything: incoming shipments, storage locations, distribution schedules, even payments to local collaborators. The entries painted a picture that made Dolores uncomfortable. References to her family's property appeared throughout the ledger, always connected to substantial monthly payments and detailed notes about storage capacity. One recurring entry read, "Mountain Ranch, our family, storage and security $500 monthly." The payments had continued from 1930 through early 1933, representing a significant income source during the hardest economic times the country had known. $500 a month for 3 years, Dolores calculated aloud. That's $18,000 total just from our property alone. In 1930s money, that was enough to buy several good ranches, Vernon replied. Your family wasn't just allowing storage. They were full partners in a major criminal enterprise. The ledger contained more than just financial records. Detailed inventories listed the contents of various cache sites throughout the valley, with her property holding the largest concentration of assets. The numbers were staggering. Gold coins valued at over $200,000, silver certificates worth $150,000, jewelry and precious stones estimated at $300,000, and bonds of uncertain but substantial value. According to these records, Vernon continued, the total assets stored on your property were worth nearly $900,000 in 1933. That's equivalent to over $12 million today. Dr. James Crawford had arrived from Denver that afternoon, bringing ground-penetrating radar equipment and a team of graduate students to conduct a proper archaeological survey. The gray-haired professor moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to handling valuable discoveries. But his excitement was obvious as he studied the ledger's contents. This is the most complete documentation of Prohibition-era criminal finance I've ever seen, Dr. Crawford told them. Most smuggling operations kept minimal records, but Kellerman was running his organization like a legitimate business. These books could rewrite the academic understanding of how Prohibition-era crime was structured and financed. The radar survey had confirmed what the ledger indicated. Beneath Dolores's barn and the surrounding area, a network of underground chambers and tunnels created a sophisticated storage and distribution facility. The technology revealed hollow spaces that perfectly matched the locations marked on Kellerman's hand-drawn map. The engineering is remarkable, Dr. Crawford explained, studying the radar printouts. These aren't crude holes in the ground. They're professionally constructed chambers with drainage systems and ventilation shafts. Someone invested serious money in creating permanent infrastructure. More disturbing were signs that others had been exploring the property recently. Fresh tire tracks near the barn belonged to vehicles that none of them recognized, and small holes drilled in the building's wooden siding suggested surveillance equipment had been installed and removed. Most troubling of all were the scratches around the foundation stones. Where the ledger had been hidden, someone else had been looking for the same thing they'd found. Marcus Reed and his people aren't just fishing for information, Vernon said grimly. They know exactly what they're looking for, which suggests they have access to historical records we haven't seen. The afternoon brought an unwelcome confirmation of their fears. Lucy arrived unannounced, driving up the ranch road with her teenage son Tom beside her in the passenger seat. Dolores could tell from her sister's expression that the visit wasn't entirely voluntary. "That man called me again," Lucy announced before she was even out of the car. "Marcus Reed. He said there might be legal complications with whatever you found, and that the family should consider accepting his offer to handle things properly." "What kind of offer?" Dr. Crawford asked, his academic interest clearly piqued. "He wants to buy the mineral rights to the property," Tom answered. "He said there might be valuable historical artifacts that could create legal problems if they're not handled through proper channels." Vernon and Dr. Crawford exchanged meaningful glances. Reed's approach was becoming more sophisticated. Instead of direct threats or simple intimidation, he was using legal concerns and family pressure to achieve his goals. He also said, Lucy continued reluctantly, that sometimes when valuable things are found on private property, the federal government can claim eminent domain rights. He suggested that working with his organization might be the best way to protect the family's interests. That's complete nonsense, Dr. Crawford said firmly. Eminent domain doesn't work that way, and treasure trove law is much more favorable to property owners than this Reed character is suggesting. He's using scare tactics to manipulate you, but the damage was already done. Lucy's visit had confirmed that Reed's organization was escalating their pressure campaign, using family relationships and legal fears to isolate Dolores and force her into cooperation. I don't understand what's happening here, Lucy said, looking around the familiar ranch with new suspicion. Yesterday, this was just Dolores's quiet little farm, and now there are strangers calling me about legal problems and valuable discoveries. What exactly did you find? Dolores made a decision that she hoped she wouldn't regret. She showed Lucy the ledger, the Prohibition-era map, and Dr. Crawford's preliminary survey results. Better to have her sister as an informed ally than an unwitting tool for Reed's manipulation. Lucy's reaction was everything Dolores had expected and feared. Excitement about the potential value quickly gave way to anxiety about the legal complications and safety concerns. This is way too big for us to handle alone, she said, after studying the documents. Maybe this Reed person is right. Maybe we do need professional help to deal with something this complex. The help we need isn't from Marcus Reed, Vernon said firmly. What we need is proper legal counsel and legitimate archaeological expertise. Dr. Crawford can provide the academic credibility, but we're going to need lawyers and possibly federal authorities before this is over. As evening approached, Dr. Crawford prepared to return to Denver with copies of the most important documents. His plan was to consult with colleagues who specialized in treasure trove law and to contact federal authorities who might have jurisdiction over Prohibition-era assets. Don't attempt any excavation until I get back, he warned. What you found is too important to risk damaging through amateur digging and too valuable to handle without proper legal protection. After Dr. Crawford left, the ranch felt exposed and vulnerable. Dolores found herself checking the windows repeatedly, looking for signs of the surveillance that she now knew was almost certainly ongoing. Wilbur had taken up a position near the barn where he could watch both the main approach road and the area around the oak tree, as if the pig understood that his humans were in some kind of danger. The discovery that had begun as an interesting historical curiosity was rapidly becoming something much more serious and potentially dangerous. With every passing hour, more people were learning about the buried treasure, and not all of them had Dolores's best interests at heart. The question now was whether she could maintain control of her own property and her family's legacy, or whether the secrets that had stayed, buried for 90 years, would ultimately destroy everything. She'd worked to preserve the silver certificate bonds gleamed under the kitchen, light-like promises from another era, each one bearing the official seal of the United States. Treasury and dates from the late 1920s. Dr. Crawford handled them with the reverence of someone who understood their historical and monetary significance, while Dolores tried to process the reality that such wealth had been buried beneath her feet for decades. These are extremely rare, Dr. Crawford explained, examining the bonds through his magnifying glass. Silver certificates from this period in these denominations are worth far more than their face value to collectors. We're looking at potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars from this single container. Vernon had found them that morning in a lead-lined box buried 4 feet beneath the barn's eastern wall, exactly where Kellerman's ledger had indicated. The preservation was remarkable. The bonds looked almost new, despite being underground for 90 years. Each certificate was individually wrapped in oiled cloth and arranged, with the kind of care that suggested their owner had. intended to return for them someday. The discovery had been part of a systematic exploration of the tunnel network that Dr. Crawford's ground-penetrating radar had revealed. Using proper archaeological techniques, they'd opened 3 different cache points and found evidence of at least 7 more storage locations throughout the property. Each excavation revealed the same pattern: professionally constructed hiding places containing assets that had been carefully preserved for long-term storage. The total value is staggering, Dr. Crawford continued, consulting his preliminary inventory notes. Based on what we've found so far and what the ledger indicates, we're potentially looking at assets worth $15 to $20 million in today's market. Lucy had arrived that morning with legal documents that Marcus Reed's organization had sent to her Denver address. The papers were professionally prepared and superficially legitimate, offering to purchase all mineral rights and subsurface assets on Dolores's property for what seemed like a generous sum. $2 million, Lucy said, spreading the contract across the table. That's more money than our family has ever seen. Maybe we should consider this seriously. It's a fraction of what's actually buried here, Vernon replied firmly. And more importantly, it's based on fraud. Reed's organization has no legal right to make this offer, and accepting it could compromise Dolores's legitimate ownership of whatever is found on her property. Dr. Crawford had spent the previous evening consulting with colleagues at the University of Colorado and with federal authorities who might have jurisdiction over Prohibition-era assets. His news was both encouraging and concerning. The good news is that treasure trove law is generally favorable to property owners, he explained. Assets found on your land belong to you, with some exceptions for items that can be proven stolen. The concerning news is that Prohibition-era criminal assets sometimes fall into gray areas that can be complicated to resolve. More troubling was the escalation in surveillance and intimidation around the property. Tom had discovered sophisticated electronic monitoring equipment hidden throughout the ranch, and multiple vehicles had been observed conducting surveillance from the public road that bordered Dolores's land. They're not just watching anymore, Tom reported, showing them photographs he'd taken with his phone. Yesterday afternoon, I saw men with surveying equipment on the hill overlooking our property. They were mapping the area systematically, like they were planning some kind of operation. The increased attention had practical implications beyond security concerns. Word of the discovery was spreading through Cedar Valley despite their efforts to maintain secrecy, and the reactions were mixed. Some neighbors were supportive and curious, but others seemed resentful of the sudden attention the ranch was receiving. Pete Morrison stopped by this morning, Vernon reported. He mentioned that strangers have been asking questions about the ranch at Murphy's General Store. Apparently, Reed's people are offering money for information about the property and the people who've been visiting. Even more concerning was the news that someone had attempted to access county property records and tax information related to Dolores's ranch. The county clerk had called to warn that multiple requests for detailed property surveys and ownership histories had been filed by organizations claiming to represent various business interests. They're building a case for some kind of legal challenge, Dr. Crawford warned. Reed's organization is too well prepared and too well funded to be operating casually. They have a plan, and they're gathering the documentation they need to implement it. Sarah Chen, the property rights attorney Dr. Crawford had recommended, arrived that afternoon with briefcases full of legal documents and a serious expression that suggested the situation was as complex as they'd feared. The law regarding found assets is complicated, she explained, spreading her materials across the dining room table. Generally speaking, treasure found on your property belongs to you, but assets that can be proven to be proceeds of criminal activity sometimes fall under federal forfeiture laws, especially if those crimes involved federal agencies or crossed state lines. She'd researched the historical record of Kellerman's organization and found evidence that their smuggling activities had included federal tax evasion, interstate transportation of illegal goods, and possible connections to violence against federal agents. The 1933 raid that ended Kellerman's operation resulted in 3 deaths, including 1 federal Treasury agent, Sarah continued. If any of the assets on your property can be connected to that violence, the federal government might assert a claim. But she also had encouraging news. Federal authorities are generally more interested in cooperation than confiscation when dealing with legitimate property owners who report discoveries voluntarily. If we handle this properly, full disclosure, professional documentation, cooperation with appropriate agencies, you're likely to retain ownership of the vast majority of what's found. The key, she emphasized, was maintaining control of the situation. Before outside interests could complicate the legal landscape, Marcus Reed's organization is almost certainly planning some kind of legal challenge to your ownership rights, Sarah warned. They might claim the assets were abandoned and therefore available for salvage, or they might argue that criminal assets can't be legally owned by private parties. Our best defense is to establish clear legal ownership before they can file any challenges. As evening approached, the kitchen had become a command center filled with historical documents, legal papers, archaeological notes, and treasure maps that seemed too extraordinary to be real. The metal fragment that had started everything sat in the center of it all, looking small and insignificant compared to the wealth and complexity it had revealed. We need to make some decisions quickly, Dr. Crawford said, reviewing his notes from the day's discoveries. We can continue excavating and documenting finds, which will strengthen your legal position, but also increase the risk of outside interference. Or we can stop here and contact federal authorities immediately, which might protect the site, but could also result in extended legal proceedings. Dolores looked around the table at the people who had become her allies in this unexpected adventure. Vernon, with his historical expertise and genuine concern for her welfare. Dr. Crawford, with his professional credentials and academic integrity. Tom, with his youthful energy and protective instincts. Sarah Chen, with her legal knowledge and strategic thinking. Even Lucy, despite her fears and doubts, was ultimately trying to protect her family's interests. We keep digging, she decided. But we do it right, with proper documentation and legal protection. This is my land and my family's legacy. I'm not going to let Marcus Reed or anyone else steal what rightfully belongs here. Outside, Wilbur maintained his patient watch over the excavation sites, and the mountain wind carried the scent of approaching weather. Whatever storms were coming, natural or man-made, they would face them together. The FBI evidence file sat on Dolores's kitchen table like an accusation. Its red, classified stamps and federal seals transforming her understanding of everything that had happened over the past week. Vernon had arrived that morning carrying the thick folder with the reluctant expression of a man about to confess a fundamental deception. "There's something I need to tell you," Vernon began, settling heavily into his chair. "Something I should have told you days ago, but couldn't until the situation reached this point." Dolores studied his face, noting the tension around his eyes and the way his hands moved with practiced precision as he opened the file. "What kind of something?" "My name is Vernon Dale, and I am a retired teacher. But for 28 years before that, I was Special Agent Vernon Dale of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, assigned to the Denver field office with a specialty in organized crime and historical cold cases." The words seemed to echo in the quiet kitchen. Dolores felt the ground shift beneath her understanding of the past week's events, realizing that nothing had been as simple or straightforward as she'd believed. "You're a federal agent, retired federal agent. I left the Bureau in 1995, but some cases never really close." Vernon pulled several photographs from the file, black and white images that showed the aftermath of violence. The 1933 raid that ended Kellerman's operation wasn't just a successful law enforcement action. 3 federal agents died in that confrontation, and the case has remained officially open for 90 years. The photographs were disturbing, crime scene images showing bodies and blood, evidence markers scattered around what appeared to be a remote mountain location. One image showed a federal treasury badge lying in the dirt beside its fallen owner. Agent Robert Morrison, Agent William Hayes, and Agent Thomas Fletcher were killed during what was supposed to be a routine arrest operation. Vernon continued. They were ambushed by Kellerman's people, who had been tipped off about the raid. The agents' bodies were found, but their killers escaped, along with evidence that could have led to prosecutions throughout the entire smuggling network. Dolores absorbed this information with growing unease. What does this have to do with my property? Vernon pulled out another document, a federal report dated 1934 that contained detailed maps and property descriptions. The FBI has always believed that Kellerman's organization buried evidence along with their money. Evidence that could identify every person involved in the smuggling network, including those responsible for killing federal agents. The maps in the report were nearly identical to the ones they'd been using to locate Kellerman's caches, but with additional notations about evidence storage and witness protection materials. One section was marked with particular emphasis: priority recovery, agent identities, and network documentation. According to informants who were captured after the raid, Vernon continued, Kellerman kept detailed records of everyone in his organization, including compromised law enforcement officials, corrupt judges, and politicians who took bribes. That information was supposed to be his insurance policy. If anyone betrayed him, he could expose the entire network. And you think that information is buried on my property? I know it is. The Bureau has had credible intelligence for decades that Kellerman's evidence files are cached somewhere in this valley, most likely on your ranch. When you called me about finding that metal fragment, I saw an opportunity to finally close a case that has haunted the FBI for almost a century. Dolores stood up abruptly, pacing to the window as she tried to process the implications. So everything you've told me about helping with historical research, about protecting my interests, that was all lies. Not lies, but not the complete truth either. I genuinely want to help you, Dolores. But I also have a responsibility to recover evidence that could bring justice for 3 murdered federal agents and possibly solve dozens of other crimes from that era. Vernon opened another section of the file, revealing documents that made the situation even more complex. The evidence we're looking for isn't just historical curiosity. Some of the people named in Kellerman's records may still be alive, or their families may still be benefiting from crimes committed 90 years ago. There are statute of limitations issues, but some crimes, like murder, never expire. What about the money? The bonds and currency we've been finding? That's where things get complicated. Assets that can be proven to be proceeds of criminal activity, especially crimes that resulted in federal agent deaths, fall under forfeiture laws. The government has the right to seize criminal assets even decades after the crimes were committed. The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. Dolores realized that her dreams of financial security from Kellerman's treasure were dissolving into legal complications that could drag on for years. There's more, Vernon said reluctantly. Marcus Reed isn't just a private treasure hunter or criminal opportunist. Our investigation suggests he's connected to organized crime families that trace their origins back to Prohibition-era operations. Some of the people mentioned in Kellerman's records may be his ancestors or business associates. This revelation reframed Reed's aggressive pursuit of the treasure entirely. He wasn't just seeking money. He was trying to prevent the exposure of criminal networks that might still be active today. Reed's organization has resources and connections that go far beyond what a legitimate business would have, Vernon continued. They've been monitoring federal cold case investigations for years, waiting for opportunities like this one. When news of your discovery started circulating, they moved quickly to try to control the situation. Dr. Crawford's arrival interrupted their conversation, but his expression suggested he already knew about Vernon's true identity. I suspected something like this, he admitted after Vernon had explained the situation. The historical documentation was too complete, too well organized for amateur research. Federal investigations produce that kind of comprehensive record-keeping. Did you know? Dolores asked Dr. Crawford directly. I suspected, but I didn't know for certain until this morning when I received calls from colleagues at the FBI asking about my involvement with this site. They wanted to confirm that proper archaeological protocols were being followed for what they described as a significant federal crime. Seen, the phrase crime seen added another layer of complexity to their situation. Dolores's property wasn't just hiding treasure. It was potentially the location where evidence from multiple federal crimes had been concealed for 90 years. What happens now? She asked. Vernon closed the FBI file and met her eyes directly. That depends partly on what we find in the remaining caches, and partly on what you decide to do. You can cooperate fully with the federal investigation, which would involve FBI archaeologists, forensic accountants, and possible witness protection if Reed's people become more aggressive. Or you can try to handle this privately, which I wouldn't recommend given the stakes involved. And if I cooperate, you'll retain ownership of assets that can't be proven to be criminal proceeds, which would probably be most of the money and bonds. The government gets the criminal evidence and any assets directly connected to federal crimes. Most importantly, you get federal protection from people like Marcus Reed, who might try to take what you found by force. Lucy had been listening from the doorway, and she entered the kitchen with fear obvious on her face. This is exactly what I was afraid of. This whole situation is way too big and too dangerous for us to handle. Maybe we should just take Reed's offer and walk away. That's not an option anymore, Vernon said firmly. Reed's organization isn't going to simply disappear if you sell them the mineral rights. They need to prevent the discovery of evidence that could expose ongoing criminal enterprises. They'll do whatever is necessary to protect themselves. Through the window, Dolores could see Tom checking the surveillance equipment they'd found around the property perimeter. The teenager had taken on security responsibilities with a seriousness that worried her, but his vigilance had already identified multiple attempts at unauthorized access to the ranch. There's something else you need to know, Vernon said, pulling out one final document from the file. We believe that someone close to this investigation is feeding information to Reed's organization. The timing of their moves, their knowledge of what we've found, their awareness of federal involvement, it all suggests they have inside information. The implications were chilling. Someone in their small circle of trusted allies was working with the people who represented a threat to everything Dolores was trying to protect. Who? She asked simply. We're not sure yet, but we're going to find out because your safety and the success of this investigation depends on it. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, and the wind carried the scent of approaching rain. The weather seemed appropriate for the tempest that was about to engulf Dolores's quiet ranch and everyone connected to its buried secrets. Frank's hidden letter lay unfolded on the kitchen table like a final gift from a husband who had carried secrets to his grave. Tom had discovered it that morning inside a metal box concealed within the barn's old foundation. Wrapped in oiled cloth and dated just weeks before Frank's sudden death 3 years earlier. My dearest Dolores, the letter began in Frank's familiar handwriting. If you're reading this, then you've found what I hoped would stay buried forever, but knew someday might come to light. Dolores read the words aloud, her voice breaking slightly as Frank's presence seemed to fill the kitchen. Vernon, Dr. Crawford, and Sarah Chen listened in. Respectful silence as the letter revealed truths that reframed everything they thought they understood. About the ranch's history, I've known about Kellerman's treasure since I was 16 years old. My grandfather told me on his deathbed, made me promise to keep the secret and protect our family from the dangers that knowledge could bring. He wasn't proud of what the family had done during Prohibition, but he understood that desperate times had forced impossible choices. The letter went on to explain how Frank's grandfather had been approached by Kellerman's organization in 1929. when the ranch was facing foreclosure and the family was on the verge of losing everything. The monthly payments from the smuggling operation had saved the property, but at a cost that haunted the family for generations. Grandpa told me that Kellerman buried more than just money on our land. He buried evidence that could destroy powerful people, evidence that men had killed for and would kill for again. 3 federal agents died trying to recover that evidence, and Grandpa was sure more people would die if it ever surfaced. Vernon leaned forward, his federal agent instincts engaged. Frank knew about the murdered agents? He knew everything, Dolores continued reading. Grandpa was there the night Kellerman brought the final shipment to our property, March 12, 1933, 3 days before the federal raid. Kellerman was panicked, said his organization had been compromised, that agents were closing in. He buried the evidence files and the last of the money, then fled north toward Canada. Grandpa never saw him again. The letter contained specific details about the burial locations that matched the sites they'd already excavated. But it also included warnings about the dangers associated with the treasure. Frank had spent his adult life researching the people and organizations connected to Kellerman's network, trying to understand what threats might still exist. Some of the names in Kellerman's files belonged to families that became legitimate businesses over the decades. But their money came from prohibition crimes, and worse. If those files surface, billions of dollars in inherited wealth could be at stake. People with that much to lose don't hesitate to eliminate threats. Dr. Crawford studied Frank's notes and maps, comparing them to the federal documents Vernon had shared. Your husband was remarkably thorough. He identified criminal families that are still active today, traced money flows that connect Prohibition-era crimes to modern business empires. This isn't just historical research. It's actionable intelligence about ongoing criminal enterprises. There's more, Dolores said, turning to the letter's final page. Frank writes about discovering surveillance of our property in the 1990s, people asking questions about our family history, attempts to purchase mineral rights from organizations he couldn't identify. The letter revealed that Frank had made contact with federal authorities in 1997, providing them with information about the buried evidence while trying to protect his family from exposure. The heart attack that killed him had occurred just days before he was scheduled to meet with FBI agents about excavating the cache sites. He was going to turn everything over to the government, Dolores whispered. He was trying to protect me by getting rid of the secret that had haunted our family for decades. Vernon's expression was grim as he processed this information. Frank's death might not have been as natural as everyone assumed. If criminal organizations knew he was planning to cooperate with federal authorities, they would have had strong motivation to prevent that meeting. The possibility that Frank had been murdered cast a dark shadow over everything that followed. Sarah Chen pulled out legal documents related to the investigation of Frank's death, which had been ruled natural causes after a brief examination by the local coroner. We should request a review of the medical records, Sarah suggested. If there's any possibility that Frank's death was connected to this case, it changes the legal and criminal implications significantly. Tom had been listening with growing anger and determination. So these people might have killed my uncle, and now they're threatening my aunt. That's not going to happen again, which is exactly why we need to be careful, Vernon warned. Frank understood the dangers, and he tried to handle them responsibly. We need to follow his example while learning from his mistakes. The letter contained one more crucial piece of information, the location of the main evidence. Cash that Kellerman had buried on his final visit to the ranch. Frank had never excavated it, but he'd marked its location and documented what he believed it contained. According to this, Dr. Crawford said, studying Frank's detailed map, the primary evidence files are buried beneath the old stone foundation behind the house. That's where we'll find the documents that identify everyone in Kellerman's network, including the people responsible for killing federal agents. The afternoon brought escalating signs that their time was running out. Multiple vehicles had been observed conducting surveillance from the public road, and electronic monitoring equipment was being discovered throughout the property, despite repeated attempts to remove it. Most concerning of all, Lucy reported that she'd received direct contact from Marcus Reed's organization. They offered me $5 million to convince you to accept their original proposal, Lucy admitted reluctantly. They said the situation was becoming dangerous for the whole family, and that cooperating with them was the only way to ensure everyone's safety. What did you tell them? Vernon asked. I said I needed to think about it. But they're not waiting for an answer. They said they'd be contacting me again tomorrow with a final offer. Sarah Chen reviewed the legal implications of Reed's escalating pressure campaign. They're moving toward direct threats now, which suggests they're running out of time. Something has forced them to accelerate their timeline, possibly pressure from higher levels of their organization. Vernon confirmed Sarah's assessment based on his federal law enforcement experience. Criminal organizations don't usually expose themselves this openly unless they're facing an immediate crisis. Reed's people are taking risks that suggest desperation. What kind of crisis? Dolores asked. Probably the same crisis Frank was trying to avoid by cooperating with federal authorities. If word gets out that Kellerman's evidence files are about to surface, every criminal organization with connections to Prohibition-era activities will want to control or destroy that information. Dr. Crawford had been using secure communications to coordinate with FBI archaeology teams who were standing by to excavate the main evidence cache. Federal agents will be here tomorrow morning with specialized equipment and security personnel. Once we begin the official excavation, the site will be under federal protection, which means tonight is Reed's last opportunity to act without direct confrontation with federal agents, Vernon concluded. We should assume they'll make their move after dark. The evening preparations took on the character of a military operation. Tom worked with Vernon to establish observation posts around the property perimeter, while Dr. Crawford used emergency communication equipment to maintain contact with federal authorities. Sarah Chen reviewed legal documents that would formally transfer the investigation to federal jurisdiction once the excavation began. Dolores found herself drawn repeatedly to Frank's letter, rereading his words and trying to understand the burden he'd carried for so many years. His final paragraph offered both comfort and challenge. I pray that you'll never have to deal with this secret, but if you do, remember that doing the right thing is sometimes dangerous, but always necessary. The people who died trying to bring justice deserve better than to be forgotten because we were afraid. As darkness settled over the ranch, Wilbur took up his familiar position near the barn, but his behavior was different. Alert and agitated in a way that suggested he sensed approaching danger. The pig had been their early warning system for buried secrets. Now he seemed to be warning them about threats that were very much alive and approaching. Whatever happens tonight, Vernon said as they completed their preparations, we need to remember that we are not just protecting treasure or solving a historical mystery. We're trying to bring justice for federal agents who died doing their job. And we're trying to prevent criminal organizations from continuing to profit from Prohibition-era crimes. Through the kitchen window, Dolores could see lights moving on the access road that led to her property, lights that belonged to vehicles that had no legitimate reason to be there. The confrontation that Frank had tried to avoid was finally coming to the ranch that had kept Kellerman's secrets for 90 years. The question now was whether they could survive the night and preserve the evidence that 3 federal agents had died trying to recover. The master key felt cold and heavy in Dolores's hand, its ornate brass surface worn smooth by decades underground. She'd found it exactly where Frank's letter had indicated, wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden inside the stone foundation behind the house. The key bore a simple brass tag with Kellerman's initials and the words, Final Cache. Evidence vault. Now, surrounded by Marcus Reed's men in her own barnyard at midnight, she understood why Frank had hidden the key. instead of using it. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. You've caused us considerable trouble. Mrs. Ramsey, Reed said, his expensive suit looking out of place in the ranch setting, but his authority unmistakable. 4 armed men flanked him, their professional demeanor and tactical equipment suggesting military or law enforcement backgrounds. But you're going to help us resolve this situation tonight. The confrontation had begun 2 hours earlier, when Reed's vehicles had driven brazenly up her access road with headlights blazing. No more surveillance, no more subtle pressure. They were making their final play for Kellerman's buried evidence before federal authorities could intervene. "You're trespassing on my property," Dolores said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "The sheriff's department has been notified." Reed smiled without warmth. "Sheriff Morrison is having a busy night with emergency calls throughout the county. Amazing how many urgent situations can arise simultaneously when properly orchestrated. By the time any law enforcement response reaches this remote location, our business will be concluded." Vernon stood beside her, his elderly frame deceptively frail-looking, but his federal agent training still evident in his alert posture. Tom had positioned himself near the barn door, young and angry, but smart enough to recognize the tactical disadvantage they faced. "The FBI knows about this operation," Vernon warned. "Federal agents will be here in the morning with excavation equipment and security personnel. You can't prevent what's already in motion, which is exactly why we're here tonight," Reed replied. "Federal involvement changes the risk profile significantly. Our organization prefers to resolve problems before they require congressional oversight and media attention." Dr. Crawford emerged from the house where he'd been, monitoring federal communications equipment. His expression was grim as he approached the group in the barnyard. "I've lost contact with the FBI Coordination Center," he reported quietly. "Our communications are being jammed by some kind of electronic interference." Reed nodded approvingly. "Professional operations require professional preparation. We've isolated this location from outside communication while we complete our work." The organized efficiency of Reed's operation was frightening. These weren't desperate treasure hunters or opportunistic criminals. They were part of something larger and more dangerous than any of them had imagined. "What exactly do you want?" Dolores asked. "Access to Kellerman's evidence files. The documents and records that identify participants in Prohibition-era criminal activities, particularly the materials that implicate families and organizations that have legitimate business interests today." Reed gestured toward the key in Dolores's hand. "Your husband spent years researching those files without opening the main cache. He understood that some secrets are too dangerous to expose, even for the sake of historical justice. Frank was planning to turn everything over to federal authorities. Frank was making a mistake that would have cost him his life and destroyed his family's security. We tried to convince him to reconsider his decision, but he was surprisingly stubborn for a man in his position. The implication was clear, and Vernon reacted with the controlled anger of a federal agent who'd seen too much violence in service of criminal enterprises. "You killed him. We protected him from making a catastrophic error in judgment. Unfortunately, the protection came too late to prevent him from hiding the evidence. Vault key where he thought his wife would never find. It reads admission of murder, casual and matter-of-fact, crystallized the danger they faced. These people had killed Frank to prevent the exposure of Prohibition-era crimes, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill others for the same reason. The key, Mrs. Ramsey, we're going to open Kellerman's evidence vault together, and you're going to help us determine which materials need to be preserved and which materials pose unnecessary risks to legitimate business interests." Tom stepped forward, his young face flushed with anger. "She's not helping you with anything. You murdered my uncle, and now you're threatening my aunt. That's not happening." One of Reed's men moved toward Tom, but Dolores raised her hand to stop the confrontation. "I'll cooperate," she said, meeting Reed's eyes directly. "But I want guarantees about my family's safety." "You're not in a position to negotiate terms," Reed replied. But I can assure you that cooperation will produce better outcomes than resistance. Vernon caught Dolores's eye and nodded slightly. Not agreement, but acknowledgement that they needed to buy time and look for opportunities. Whatever federal backup was coming would arrive eventually, but they had to survive until it did. The master key represented more than just access to Kellerman's treasure. It was the last barrier between justice for 3 murdered federal agents and the continued concealment of crimes that had generated billions in illicit wealth over 9 decades. As Reed's men prepared equipment for opening the evidence vault, Wilbur emerged from the shadows near the barn, his alert posture suggesting that the pig sensed danger, approaching from directions that humans couldn't detect. The final confrontation over secrets that had been buried for 90 years was about to begin. The historical crime evidence lay scattered across the stone, foundation-like confessions from another century. Each document and photograph a piece of testimony that had waited 90 years to be heard. Kellerman's evidence vault had contained everything Vernon had hoped to find, and more. Detailed records of every person involved in the smuggling network, including the 3 federal agents who had died trying to recover exactly this information. My God, Dr. Crawford breathed. Photographing pages of handwritten testimony that identified the killers of Agents Morrison, Hayes, and Fletcher. These are signed confessions from witnesses to the murders. Kellerman documented everything: who gave the orders, who pulled the triggers, who helped dispose of the bodies. Reed stared at the evidence with visible horror, understanding that decades of careful concealment were unraveling in real time. "You don't understand what this means," he said, his polished demeanor finally cracking. "These files don't just implicate criminals from the 1930s, they trace money and connections that lead directly to legitimate businesses operating today." Vernon was carefully organizing the documents, his federal agent training evident in how he handled potential evidence. That's exactly the point. Criminal enterprises don't just disappear, they evolve and legitimize themselves while maintaining their core activities. This evidence can finally close cases that have been open for nearly a century. The sound of approaching helicopters interrupted the confrontation. Reed's head snapped up at the distinctive whop-whop-whop of rotors, and his men immediately began scanning the sky with night vision equipment. "Federal agents," one of his men reported. "2 helicopters approaching from the east, estimated arrival in 3 minutes. Reed made a decision that revealed the true stakes of their operation. Instead of attempting to flee with the evidence, he pulled out a small device that looked like a military detonator. "If we can't control this information, then no one can have it," he announced. "This entire site will be destroyed, along with everyone who's seen these files." Tom stepped forward with the fearless anger of youth. "You're not destroying anything. This belongs to the families of those dead agents. They deserve to know the truth about what happened. The truth is a luxury that some people can't afford," Reed replied coldly. 90 years ago, powerful people made decisions that created the foundation for legitimate businesses worth billions of dollars today. Exposing those foundations would destroy innocent families who've built respectable lives on inherited wealth. Sarah Chen, who had been monitoring radio communications from inside the house, emerged with news that changed the tactical situation entirely. "The FBI has arrested 12 people in coordinated raids across 3 states tonight. Your organization has been compromised from the inside. Someone has been feeding federal authorities information about your operations for months." Reed's expression shifted to something approaching panic. "That's impossible. Your security protocols didn't account for the possibility that someone in your organization actually believes in justice for murdered federal agents," Vernon interrupted. "The FBI has been building a case against Prohibition-era crime families for years, waiting for exactly this kind of evidence to surface." The helicopters were clearly audible now, their searchlights beginning to sweep the property as they approached for landing. Reed's men were professional enough to recognize a no-win tactical situation when they faced one. "Federal agents," came the amplified voice from the lead helicopter. "This area is under federal investigation. Drop your weapons and place your hands where they can be seen." Reed looked at the evidence spread across the foundation stones, then at the approaching aircraft that represented the end of his organization's ability to control the situation. 90 years, he said quietly. 90 years of successful concealment, destroyed by a pig that wouldn't stop digging. Vernon carefully gathered the most important documents, the signed confessions, the photographs of the murdered agents, the financial records that traced criminal money through decades of investment and reinvestment. "Justice doesn't have an expiration date," he told Reed as federal agents began rappelling from the helicopters. "Agents Morrison, Hayes, and Fletcher deserve better than to be forgotten because their murders were profitable for your families." As FBI tactical teams secured the property and began processing the crime scene, Dolores stood beside the evidence that had cost her husband his life and nearly cost her own. The master key that had unlocked Kellerman's vault lay in her palm, like a symbol of choices made and prices paid for seeking truth in a world that preferred comfortable lies. The historical crime evidence would finally tell the story of 3 federal agents who had died in service of justice, and the criminal families who had profited from their murders for 90 years. Some secrets, once exposed, had the power to right wrongs that had been buried far too long. Wilbur stood guard over the excavation site, his patient vigil finally complete after 3 years of trying to tell the humans about the secrets buried beneath their feet. The pig had been more persistent in seeking justice than the people who were supposed to protect it. The case that had begun with a curious discovery was ending with the restoration of truth, and the promise that some crimes, no matter how carefully hidden, would eventually face the judgment they deserved. The memorial plaque caught the morning sunlight like a promise fulfilled, its polished bronze surface bearing the names of 3 federal agents who had finally received the recognition they deserved. 6 months had passed since that dramatic night when helicopters descended on her ranch, and Dolores often found herself standing beside the monument that had transformed her property from a place of hidden secrets into a beacon of justice and remembrance. In memory of federal agents Robert Morrison, William Hayes, and Thomas Fletcher, killed in the line of duty, March 15, 1933, their sacrifice led to justice, though it took 90 years to arrive. The words were simple, but they represented the resolution of one of the FBI's oldest cold cases and the exposure of criminal networks that had operated with impunity for nearly a century. The evidence that Kellerman had so carefully preserved had proven even more valuable than Vernon had hoped, leading to arrests, prosecutions, and the recovery of billions in assets that had been built on Prohibition-era crimes. Vernon approached from the direction of the visitor center that now occupied the renovated barn, carrying a folder of documents that had become a familiar sight over the past months. His role had evolved from undercover federal agent to official historical consultant, helping to process the massive archive of evidence that continued to yield new discoveries about Prohibition-era organized crime. "The latest FBI report," he said, handing her the folder. 47 indictments across 6 states, including Marcus Reed and most of his organization. The evidence from Kellerman's files has been sufficient to pierce the corporate veils of businesses that were laundering Prohibition money right up until the day we opened that vault. Dolores smiled as she read through the summary. Reed's sentencing was scheduled for next month. Federal charges including murder conspiracy, racketeering, and obstruction of justice that would ensure he spent the rest of his life in prison. More satisfying was the news that the families of the murdered federal agents had finally received official recognition and substantial compensation from assets recovered through the investigation. The transformation of her property into a historical education center had exceeded everyone's expectations. Dr. Crawford's team had completed The full archaeological survey, revealing tunnel systems and cache sites that told a comprehensive story about Prohibition-era smuggling operations. The site now attracted visitors from across the country who came to learn about that turbulent period in American history. The school groups are my favorite, Dolores admitted. Watching a busload of high school students emerge from the visitor center, these kids are learning about justice and persistence, about how ordinary people can make a difference when they choose to do the right thing. Tom had become the center's youngest tour guide, his enthusiasm for the story infectious, as he led groups through the tunnels and explained how his Uncle Frank had protected the evidence for decades while planning to eventually turn it over to federal authorities. The teenager had found his calling in education, already planning to study history and law enforcement when he graduated. Lucy arrived that afternoon with news from Denver, where she'd been working with federal attorneys on the final resolution of the family's legal claims to recovered assets. The government had proven remarkably generous in interpreting treasure trove law, allowing Dolores to retain ownership of currency and bonds that couldn't be directly connected to federal crimes. The final settlement is $12.6 million, Lucy announced, still seeming amazed by the figure. After taxes and legal expenses, you're looking at enough money to maintain this property, fund the educational programs, and live comfortably for the rest of your life. But money, Dolores had learned, was the least important part of what they'd recovered. The real treasure was the restoration of truth and the knowledge that Frank's sacrifice had ultimately served the cause of justice he'd believed in so deeply. Sarah Chen had established a legal foundation to manage the site's educational mission and ensure that the memorial would be maintained in perpetuity. The foundation also funded ongoing research into Prohibition-era crimes, continuing the work that Kellerman's evidence had made possible. We've received a request from the Smithsonian, Sarah reported during their monthly board meeting. They want to create a traveling exhibit about Prohibition-era organized crime, using materials from your site as the centerpiece. It would bring this story to museums across the country. The request represented validation of something Dolores had come to understand over the past months, that her family's story was part of a much larger American story about crime and justice, about the consequences of moral choices, and about the persistence of truth even when it's buried for generations. Wilbur had achieved a kind of celebrity status as the pig who solved a 90-year-old mystery. Visitors always asked to see him, and he seemed to enjoy the attention, though he'd returned to normal pig behavior now that his years-long mission was complete. The area where he dug so persistently was now marked with a small plaque crediting his role in the discovery. As evening approached, Dolores walked the familiar paths of her property with new appreciation for the land that had shaped her life. The ranch was still home, but it was also something larger now, a place where justice had finally been served, where 3 murdered federal agents had been honored, and where visitors could learn about the importance of choosing truth over comfortable lies. Vernon joined her for their customary sunset conversation on the front porch, both of them watching the mountains that had witnessed so much history over the decades. "Do you ever regret calling me that first night?" he asked. "Your life would have been much simpler if you'd just filled in Wilbur's holes and forgotten about that metal fragment." Dolores considered the question seriously, in thinking about everything that had changed since that cold Tuesday morning when she decided to investigate her pig's obsessive digging. The fear, the danger, the loss of privacy, the transformation of her quiet ranch into a place of national significance. Frank used to say that doing the right thing is sometimes dangerous, but always necessary, she replied. I think he would be proud that his sacrifice finally brought justice for those federal agents, even if it took longer than he'd planned. The memorial plaque caught the last rays of sunlight, a beacon of remembrance on land that had been transformed from a hiding place for criminals into a monument to the persistence of justice. Some secrets once exposed, had the power to heal wounds that had festered for generations. And sometimes the most unlikely heroes were the ones who simply refused to stop digging until the truth came to light.